Oh, hello, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. It is the hold on, something's making noise that I need to turn off for your listening pleasure, or something similar. So it's Sunday, and today, therefore, is the Sunday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box. And today we're going to talk about one of the most popular, but also one of the most misunderstood composers of all time, none other than Peter Tchaikovsky. Now, Tchaikovsky was much like a lot of 19th century composers, popular in his own lifetime and popular after his death without any cessation. Who are the other composers that we can put into that category? Well, Beethoven, popular in his lifetime, never not became popular. Wagner, popular in his lifetime, never became unpopular. Liszt, popular in his lifetime, and I would say that certainly his piano works never went out of fashion among the great pianists. Same with Brahms, popular in his lifetime, popular afterwards. Dvorak, you can say the same. Schumann, I think you can really say the same. Although his popularity ebbed a bit, but he was always a sort of composer that was in the central European repertoire. And we could name others, but I think that list is sufficient. Now, which compositions of Tchaikovsky were beloved in his lifetime and after? The short answer is almost all of them. But I think that Tchaikovsky is probably most thought of as a great ballet composer, probably the best ballet composer ever, and I would agree with that. His operas also popular, but more so in Russia, and this is mainly because fewer singers outside of Russia can sing well in Russian. That changed over the years, but old habits die hard. And there were fewer translations of his operas into other languages than there were in terms of the Germanic and Italian operas, which, when translated, singing was popular as it was at one time in the and really throughout the 19th into the early and mid 20th century. The Italian operas had German and English translations. The German operas, ditto. The French operas, the same, less so for the Russian. But what I want to talk about are my favorite set of Tchaikovsky compositions, which are his symphonies, because I want to make an argument that Tchaikovsky is actually one of the greatest symphonists from the golden age of the symphony, the 19th century. Now, generally, when we talk about the big, great symphonists of this era, you talk about Beethoven first and foremost. I would think that everyone agrees with that. You then talk about Brahms. Now, Brahms was unique in that he sort of made sure that the symphony remained a central element of orchestral performance in an age where people like Liszt were composing a lot of symphonic poems, and an age where Wagner was reinventing opera into a much more substantial and serious art form. But Brahms was there to say in the mid to late 19th century, no, the symphony is still equally as important as it was in the age of Beethoven, Schubert, and sort of slightly after Schubert, Schumann. Their names sound the same, but they are different, much like Iraq and Iran. But once we go to war with both, what difference will that make to you folks? I don't know. And then the third B of the three great symphonists from the European and really the Germanic tradition of the 19th century was, of course, Bruckner. Bruckner, who had very lengthy, beautiful symphonies. I've done videos on him. To learn more about Bruckner, listen to those videos, and of course, listen to his symphonies based on the conductors I recommend to you in that video. I'm really bad at promoting stuff, aren't I? But, live and learn, live and learn. Training wheels have to fall off someday. So anyway, on to Tchaikovsky. Because of the popularity of his ballets and his incidental music, his overtures and things like that, think the 1812 overture, which is used. It was a piece that was composed to celebrate the anniversary of Russia's defeat of Napoleonic France, but it's used now for patriotic occasions in many countries. I mean, the Boston Pops under Arthur Fiedler began playing it for the 4th of July, even though Russia's battles against Napoleon took place long after the American War of Independence. Go figure. But what about Tchaikovsky's symphonies? I would say that Tchaikovsky is one of the best symphonists of all time. I would put him in my top four, alongside Beethoven, Brahms, and Bruckner. Now, Tchaikovsky's symphonies were interesting in that they relied less on strict adherence to sonata form compared to, let's say, a Beethoven character or a Brahms character. Some of them almost considered them tone poems, symphonic poems with movements. But I would say that they do adhere to a unique symphonic form in the Romantic style, but the form is really less important than the actual emotional weight and profundity of the music. And I would say the music is incredibly profound. Tchaikovsky's chordal and harmonic development is much underrated. His ability as an orchestrator, aka an arranger, is also very underrated. He was able to create such a lush sound with the orchestra, a very complete sound. And I would describe it most importantly as a sound where the strings, the winds, and the brass were able to blend together really well, where composers who were less good at orchestration, the brass and the winds and the strings, they didn't always sound like they belonged on the same stage at the same time. With Tchaikovsky, there was no worry about that. He was able to blend each instrument magnificently while still using the most quintessentially identifiable aspects of the instruments that make up an orchestra to great effect. So that's another thing that I think Tchaikovsky is very underrated for. Now, melodic development is usually what he's given the most credit for. And here, of course, I think he still needs more credit because his melodies weren't just about creating sort of vague motifs, they were really about telling a story. In the same way that Bruckner was the master of using chords and harmony to tell a story, Tchaikovsky did the same with melody. And therefore, the narrative elements of the symphonies of Bruckner and Tchaikovsky, even though they're completely different in style and form, they're similar in the sense that they both draw you in because the composers are telling you something, and you really only know what they're telling you once you've listened to the whole thing. Now, Tchaikovsky in his lifetime wrote seven symphonies, and then there was an unfinished one that was later on reconstructed. Eugene Ormandy, I think, was one of the first to actually record it. But the symphonies that he composed in his lifetime, many of them were recorded quite widely as part of the standard repertoire, even though many critics wished that they weren't. Now, when it comes to critics, first of all, I don't give a damn what critics say. Well, aren't I being a critic? No, I'm not really being a critic. I'm being someone that's bearing my soul and telling you what I like and what you may or may not like. But of course, because I'm not a politician or a tyrant, I'm not telling you what to like. I'm merely exposing you to things that you may or may not like. Now, Tchaikovsky is one of the reasons of many that he's misunderstood is that because he was the most internationally famous Russian composer by the turn of the 20th century, he's sometimes characterized falsely as the most quintessentially Russian composer, where this isn't true at all. Just ask the Russians themselves. Now, Russian classical music developed much later than its European counterparts, and there's a reason for this. European classical music is derived from liturgical music, whether the Roman Catholic Church or various Protestant churches. Remember Bach, who in many ways was the first European classical composer that was really lauded as a technical genius. He never thought of himself as someone whose music would be played in secular environments like a concert hall. He thought of himself first and foremost as a Lutheran composer, a composer of the Lutheran Church. And in Russia, you had a different situation because instrumental music is not present in the Orthodox Christian churches of the world. So in Orthodox churches, there is chanting. In churches like the Greek and Assyrian and Syriac, you have monophonic chanting. And the best way to think of it is think, something that sounds very ancient, because it is very ancient. It dates back to the liturgical practices of the early church, of the apostles of Christ. In the Russian Orthodox Church, in around the 17th century, you had polyphony added, but still no instrumentation. And so you didn't have that connectivity between the liturgical and the secular in terms of classical music development the way you had in the Catholic and Protestant parts of Europe. But in the early 19th century, you had the arrival of Russia's first real classical composer, and this was Mikhail Glinka. Now, Glinka set off a huge wave of popular and populist classical music in Russia. Russia was rushing to catch up. It's alliteration. It's a free show, folks. And So you had a group of musicians develop, and they coalesced as the Five, sometimes known as the Mighty Handful. And these were Modest Mussorgsky, um, Balakirev, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, did I say Borodin? Who else? So Borodin, Balakirev, Rimsky-Korsakov. That's three. Four would be God. Okay, that's Borodin, Balakirev, Modest Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, and then Cesar Cui. Those were the five, the mighty handful. And those composers developed a musical tradition that focused on promoting national-minded music. Music rooted in the folkish traditions of Russian culture, music written in a more organic rather than disciplined style of pedagogy, in other words, a bit more self-taught and a bit less emphasis on the conservatoire model from Europe, at least in the early days. It rejected the major influences of what was going on in Europe at the time, and they were saying, right, this is a uniquely Russian tradition. And while the orchestras themselves might have the same or similar instruments to those you would find in Berlin or in Paris or Vienna or Milan, it would nevertheless be a very different tradition. Those were the five, and many of their own, their own students went on to be great Russian composers later on in the 19th century. Rimsky-Korsakov himself lived into the 20th century, so we're talking relatively modern here. Mussorgsky would have as well, but he loved to drink, and that's why Rimsky sometimes had to help him finish some of his work. Fun guy, as I say, a modest guy, but with very little to be modest about. Again, it's a free show, so you're not allowed to complain. Anyway, so at the same time that the Five, the mighty handful, were promoting a quintessentially and uniquely Russian style of romantic classical style music, Tchaikovsky was in a very different world psychologically. He knew the Five, he corresponded with them. Sometimes they were friendly, sometimes less so. But Tchaikovsky was someone who generally found himself being influenced by the sort of pre-Mozartian Italian composers and somewhat by Mozart. Tchaikovsky, unlike all of the German and almost all of the European composers of his era, was not influenced by Beethoven. He wasn't necessarily a fan of Wagner, who was probably the most popular European composer at that time. He did things in his own way, but he wasn't much into Russian nationalist folklore the way that, let's say, Mussorgsky, Balakirev, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Borodin very much were. Now, of course, Tchaikovsky did compose music about Russian themes, but most of those were commissioned. The 1812 overture, he was commissioned by the Tsar to write a celebratory patriotic piece, and likewise, his March Slav was commissioned to celebrate the Russian liberation of Serbia. And so his symphonies themselves, much like Beethoven and Brahms, were generally they were not programmatic music. They were numbered symphonies, and they were very unique. It's because of Tchaikovsky's popularity. It's really difficult to explain how different they were. Not only very different than what was going on in Russia, but at his time, but they were very different than what was going on in Europe. But it's also important to remember that much as Wagner was an international superstar who was played in London and Paris and New York and Chicago, again, the 19th century isn't all that long ago in terms of the way society is. Some people might think that it's the Middle Ages because people have been conditioned by demonic forces in academia to think that anything that's sort of older than 20 years is ancient history. But the fact of the matter is there's a great deal of sociological, cultural, and even technological continuity between what we call the late modern period of European history, in which America is obviously a part as a European-derived society, and the present day. And so these people, these names that I'm mentioning, shouldn't seem like we're talking about someone, in the age of, Tiglath-Pileser, the ancient king of Assyria. We're not talking about ancient Babylon. We're talking about places and spaces that we would easily recognize as very modern and in many ways much more placid than our own century, when many of these cultures that we're talking about are bombing each other, back then less so. So anyway, Tchaikovsky was someone who was incredibly internationally popular, as was Wagner, as was Liszt, as were the great conductors that were performing Beethoven. And he was, in many ways, a composer that was sort of torn between a Russian identity that was thrust upon him, a Russian identity that was genuine because he absorbed the influences around him, and someone who could be described as a cosmopolitan composer from a culture whose other leading composers were arguing for the opposite of cosmopolitanism, a nationally folkish derived type of music. Now, what about the symphonies themselves? Well, his last three numbered symphonies tend to be the ones that people love the most: Symphony 4, Symphony 5, and Symphony 6. Now, Symphony 4 and 5 are equally sort of, I would call, titanic in nature. They're very grand, and they're bookended by, of course, very, very stirring and at times fast first and fourth movements, with slower, more restrained second and third movements, but all of which are very beautiful. And one thing that I will say about Tchaikovsky, and this is incredibly apparent in both his fourth and fifth symphonies, his ability to write great, I'll say, integrate great melodies into his symphonies is something that he does equally well in sort of grandiose fortissimo or fast passages as he can in quiet and slower passages. And that's not easily done. But Tchaikovsky was able to win you over with his sort of slower and more restrained movements, as well as his more grandiose movements, the ones afterwards you just want to sort of stand up and shout. Because at the end of both the fourth and fifth symphony, it almost feels like a romantic rallying cry. You want to just stand up and shake your fists. The Sixth Symphony is very different. The Sixth Symphony is a meditation on death. And many at the time thought that it was a symphony about Tchaikovsky's own suicide, although it's now disputed that he did kill himself. A lot of things about his life are lies that we know about, because whenever there's someone who's popular but who's somewhat enigmatic, people can kind of make up what they want about one's personal life. But anyway, it was very much a meditation on death, known to the world as the Pathetique, even though I don't believe Tchaikovsky ever used that himself to refer to pathos. And that's very unique, because the first movement is sort of a mini symphonic statement in and of itself, and the fourth movement is almost all carried by the strings, and it's deliberative yet lush, and as it dies down with the day crescendo at the end, it's just really gorgeous. But there is a symphony in this period that we don't talk about enough, that I would say is arguably Tchaikovsky's finest symphony. It was composed between his fourth and fifth symphonies, and it's his only one that's programmatic. Now, what do we mean in the classical music tradition? Why does it say that only subscribers are allowed to comment? That's not what the programmatic tradition says. I didn't do that. So anyone who thinks I'm some sort of jackass, let me see reaction. No, I want reactions on. Yeah, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, folks. I'm sorry if you want to comment. I don't know why it says that, but hey, you can subscribe for free and then comment. But I honestly did that by mistake. Anyway, what is programmatic music? Programmatic music, put simply, is music with a title. Think symphonic poems like Richard Strauss's Toll Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks, Death and Transfiguration. These are themes. Think of an opera. That's sort of the ultimate in programmatic music. It's got characters and a story, a plot, everything. And this symphony, of course, is the Manfred Symphony, that's taken from, of course, the great Byronic poem. Well, Byron himself is probably the most Byronic of all the Byrons. Obviously, Schumann also wrote an overture based on that poem, but this is an entire four-movement symphony based on that poem. And the reason I love this symphony, I think it's Tchaikovsky's longest, but it's his most musically musically intricate. I would say his most musically sophisticated. And while it has all of those quintessential Tchaikovsky elements, the integrated melodies that move the narrative along, the surprise introduction of a new melody right when an old one is sort of still in the midst of its development, the lush orchestration, that unified sound between the strings, the brass, and the woodwinds. All of that is there, but there's some dissonance in it which you might not associate with Tchaikovsky. There's a lot of modern, very modern, especially for the time, harmonic concepts. It's just a very unique symphony. And because of its length and its complexity and its requirement for an organ in the fourth movement, it hasn't been as recorded nearly as much as the fourth, fifth, and sixth symphonies. Um, and this leads me on to who I recommend for the others. So let's start with the fourth, fifth, and sixth, because if someone's recorded one, they generally record all three. I would say the best conductors for those symphonies, in no particular order, are Wilhelm Mengelberg. We'll start with him. And what made him so brilliant with Tchaikovsky, and Tchaikovsky himself loved Mengelberg's conducting of his own symphonies, Mengelberg being the de facto founder of the Concertgebouw Orchestra in Amsterdam. Um, what Mengelberg is able to do is he's able to bring out the nuance in Tchaikovsky, the hidden gems, the Easter eggs, to use a modern term, that a lot of conductors just, they just sort of drive over as if though they're driving one of those machines that they use to flatten the asphalt on the street. You know what I mean? The big rolling thing in cartoons, Bugs Bunny would get run over by one and be flat, but a few minutes later he'd pop himself back to life. That thing. I know it's got a name. So a lot of conductors do that with Tchaikovsky. Well, where Mengelberg brings out all of the subtleties, and there's so many of them, and he's able to do that without sacrificing any of the romanticism. Mengelberg, of course, is remembered as one of the great romanticists of all time. So Mengelberg, one of the finest, and I mention him first because Tchaikovsky loved Mengelberg's performances of his own music. Another great one is Furtwängler, because Furtwängler makes no attempt to Tchaikovskyize Tchaikovsky. And I really appreciate that, because a lot of people go overboard and they try to be more royal than the king when conducting Tchaikovsky. They try to de-emphasize the things people pay less attention to in Tchaikovsky, the rhythm, the chordal development, and just go melody crazy. Where Furtwängler does no such thing. He approaches Tchaikovsky with a beautiful neutrality. And by that I mean, he's saying, look, I'm approaching it the way I would approach any piece. I want to use the intuition, and no one had better intuition than Furtwängler, to bring out the most beautiful elements that are authentic to the evolution of the composition from the beginning of the first movement to the end of the fourth. And he does that extraordinarily in both the fourth, fifth, and sixth symphonies that he recorded. Who else was great? Stokowski. Stokowski was absolutely brilliant. Stokowski conducts Tchaikovsky so well that it's almost as if he's in Tchaikovsky's head. If Mengelberg knew the music inside and out and was able to bring out the nuances so with such ravishing detail, Stokowski was, also some call him Stokowski, some call him Stokowski. Let's have a potato and a tomato and a tomato and a potato, and all call it a jolly good day at the local McDonald's. But when it comes to Stokowski, he understood the psyche of Tchaikovsky like no other. And when he conducted the music, it was almost as if he became one with the composer. I know that sounds weird, but again, talking about music is something that is, go and listen to it. But, well, what should I listen to? I'm telling you what to listen to. Well, you jackass, why aren't you playing the music? Well, because you don't know how YouTube works. And unless you're a shareholder of Google, I'm really not interested in that particular line of opinion from you, good sir. So anyway, Stokowski, very, very brilliant at getting inside the head of Tchaikovsky. Who else is great? Nikolai Golovanov. Golovanov. I'm, having a vowel incident here. Now, Golovanov, unfortunately, only that we know about, recorded 2 of Tchaikovsky's symphonies. He recorded many other overtures and other incidental music, but he did record the 6th Symphony and recorded the first symphony. More on that later. Golovanov as a conductor was marvelous. In many ways, he was the quintessential Russian conductor. Great sense of intuition, and all of his characteristics of the orchestra that he really brought out. The harsh vibrato of the brass, a uniquely Russian thing. The very much the almost the caustic sound of the string section, the very bright woodwinds, but bright but full. All of that was what Golovanov was able to bring out. Wonderful sense of rubato, but very different, which means the ability to be poetic and flexible with the tempi, but very different in his rubato than many of his European counterparts. Another great Russian conductor who recorded every piece that Tchaikovsky ever composed was the king of 20th century Russian conductors, along with Golovanov, and this was Yevgeny Sviatlonov. Wonderful, wonderful conductor. Again, very different than European interpretations of Tchaikovsky. So if you're from America or Europe, you might find this weird at first in some respects. But once you get used to it, you think, it makes sense. It's Tchaikovsky in a much more sort of less about the lushness and more about the immediacy and the purpose, and that's something I would ascribe to Sviatlonov and Golovanov. Herbert von Karajan, also beautiful Tchaikovsky. No one made it more clear that Tchaikovsky was great at blending strings, winds, and brass than Karajan, because Karajan was all about sound, where others focused on rhythm or detail or rubato. Karajan sculpted all of the pieces he conducted, whether German, which was his sort of most comfortable repertoire, or his French, his Italian, or Russian. He conducted all of it. It was all about sculpting the music with the sound. The sound and the timbre, the quality of the sound is where the musical information and the the emotional sincerity came through. So those are my recommendations there. Now, Tchaikovsky's first three numbered symphonies generally aren't as popular as his later ones. They're very good, though, particularly the first, was subtitled Winter Dreams. Now, this one is it's like an adventure. Listening to that first symphony it's really like, it's like a road trip. It's like, Pete's road trip with me. I mean, again, it's a free show, people. It's funny that whenever I make a joke, I see the people who are watching live, and whenever I make a joke or tell people what I really think of them, someone leaves. It's amazing how sensitive people are, which is why we're living in a more violent society than we used to, because people have lost their sense of Christian restraint. They've lost their respect for freedom of speech, which means we can all say things, but it's in one ear, out the other if you don't want to hear it. But everyone feels that they're entitled to control other people, that you have to think what I think, you have to say what I want you to say, you have to behave the way I want you to behave. And that's not the law of Christ. That's not the natural law of God. That's not the common law. That's not the US Constitution. This is the law of the barbarian. This is the law of the jungle. And so if you're not even able to behave yourself like a normal human being in a Christian society, maybe you should stop listening to this music I'm talking about and just go to the jungle and live in a mud hut. I really think that some people are probably more of that inclination. But we can always try to civilize ourselves, and I think that we ought to try. So yeah, the first symphony, the Winter Dreams, as it's called, it's like a road trip with Tchaikovsky. It really is a journey, and it's got so much wonderful energy. Sviatlonov does a great job on that. Golovanov does a great job on that. Karajan does a great job on that. His second and third symphonies are probably, and they're all great, but they're my least favorite because they're somewhat, in hindsight, of what he would go on to do later, a bit more derivative. But they're unique in that they are also semi-programmatic, in that, unlike the fourth, fifth, and sixth, and that the second was about Little Russian themes. Little Russia was the term that was used at the time to denote an area that is generally part of modern Ukraine. And so themes from those regions of what is now Ukraine, what was then referred to as Little Russia, were all over that symphony. And the third was also about taking themes from a specific location. It was the Polish symphony, because although it still sounds very much like Tchaikovsky, he Tchaikovsky'd it up, but he is borrowing and using Polish themes in that symphony. So, taken in totality, yes, I believe Tchaikovsky was one of the finest symphonists of all time. Very different than the three Bs of symphony, Beethoven, Brahms, and Bruckner, but nevertheless, one of, I believe, the top four great symphonists. But we also need to acknowledge Schubert, Schumann, and Dvorak were also wonderful symphonists of a 19th century in which the symphony started to get a lot of competition. There's a lot of competition out there because the symphonic poem really became a thing. Other forms of programmatic music without a strict form became increasingly popular. The opera under Wagner became much more sophisticated, and that led to many overtures and preludes becoming standard concert repertoire, and so forth. But that's just my take. Let me know what you think. And as always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.